Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of 2-Minute Warning, which is a feature interview series Gulf Intelligence conducts every week to take a slightly deeper dive into the trends impacting the energy transition. We're honored this week to be joined by Mr. Timur, the head of Energy Technology Policy Division at the IEA, who has just published the Energy Technology Perspectives 2020 report, which couldn't be more timely. Welcome, Mr. Timur.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me today.
Timur, perhaps we could just kick off with some of the key takeaways from the Energy Technology Perspectives 2020.
Yes, of course, with pleasure. So the report that we carried out and released just today, just this morning, Paris time, in fact, is really driven by the many government and industry pledges that we have seen coming in over the last couple of months and years to reach net zero emissions sometime over the course of this century. Many of them pledging, in fact, for the year 2050. And we wanted to understand what these pledges actually mean in practice, in energy practice. And
you're not the only ones, by the way. Everybody wants to know the answer to that question. When BP says net zero, what do they mean?
I'm sure we'll find out, and I'm sure they will tell us. But we've been trying to look at this for the world as a whole, trying to understand what it actually might mean for the deployment of clean energy technologies. And it's a very long report, a very comprehensive report in which we looked through 800 different technologies. But if you want to sum up the three key findings, I think to my mind there were three main messages that we brought forward in the report. Number one is you cannot reach net zero emissions, certainly not by the year 2050, if you don't address the emissions from the existing infrastructure. You will know that many of the assets in power generation, in particular coal-fired power plants, but also in many heavy industries, iron and steel production, chemicals production, cement production, are still very young or have just recently been refurbished, in particular in Asia. They will continue to emit over the next 5 decades or so, unless we find ways to deal with these assets. Second key message is that we won't be able to reach net zero emissions without a strong push on clean energy technology innovation. We are, of course, all used to seeing these success stories, solar PV, on and offshore wind, electric cars, etc. These have been great successes over the last couple of years or so. And we read in the energy news almost every day about new projects coming in, such as hydrogen-based steel making, electric trucks, hydrogen trucks, etc. But the truth is that many of the technologies that we will need for reaching net zero are still not commercially available today. And the third key message that we are trying to bring forward in this year's report is that you need to massively scale up clean energy technologies as well as their supporting infrastructure. For example, you won't be reaching net zero emissions without a strong increase in electricity generation for supplying our electric cars, electrifying our homes, factories, etc., for producing hydrogen and other synthetic fuels. So we'll need a lot more power generation capacity. We'll need a lot more electrolyzers to produce hydrogen. We'll need a lot more carbon capture, utilization and storage, and so on and so on.
There's no point in having 1 million electric vehicle cars on the road if they're being powered by coal burning power stations, ultimately, is your point. And we're seeing, surprisingly, coal power increasing even in Germany and the most green of countries. How can we get rid of coal at the start, you think?
So in some cases, so I think when it comes to electric cars, of course, the situation is very different by country. So at a global level, we do see some emissions savings, actually quite notable emission savings already coming with electric cars today, even on a well-to-wheel basis. But of course, the situation is very different by country. If you are in Norway, where your power mix is basically decarbonized, then you have a lot of emission savings. if you're in countries where you are relying very much on coal for power generation, then the situation is very different. Now,
and yet Norway is exporting all their oil to be burned somewhere else. But tell me one question. Why, it may be interesting if Norway actually decided to stop exporting crude oil. That would be interesting. Why now for this report? Why, obviously in the middle of a global pandemic, why now do you think is the right time to put this report out addressing net zero?
I think there are, when you look at the pandemic, I think there are two ways of looking at it. One is it can be a real major setback to clean energy technology progress and towards reaching our long-term climate goals, because governments will have tighter budgets. So RD&D in clean energy technologies will be a bit more limited. The same will be for companies. But there is also an opportunity that might come with the outbreak out of the pandemic. You might actually be wanting to revisit your portfolios, your RD&D portfolios, your technologies that you're supporting. And if you take that opportunity, then the pandemic can actually be a means to accelerate progress towards reaching net zero emissions. And this is one of the key drivers for why we've been trying to bring out this report just now.
Is it too early, or is there any indications yet which of those two is winning? Is COVID an accelerator for the great transition, the great energy transition, or is it a big hurdle because people are just too preoccupied with economic survival?
I think there's no one answer to this, unfortunately. But what you're seeing, for example, in some of these success stories that I mentioned earlier, for electric cars, we are actually seeing electric cars sales globally to be incredibly persistent despite the outbreak of the pandemic. We were projecting earlier in this year that electric car sales could actually exceed this year the ones of last year. And what I'm seeing in the monthly data over the last couple of months is actually that this expectation might be confirmed. So there's an incredible resilience that comes with these new technologies that have made it into the market. The other side of the coin, of course, is that there could be setbacks. So far, we've been very positive. We've been seeing positive developments on the policy side of things when it comes to CCS, for example. We've seen a continued push for hydrogen technologies, but this should not be taken for granted. These are new technologies. There could be delays in projects, demonstration projects. That would ultimately slow down the clean energy transition.
Is there any area, we deal a lot in the Middle East with the major international oil companies and the national oil companies. And of course, the majors, the IOCs as they're called, have made some commitments towards net zero by 2040, 2050, etc. But where would you identify today are the sectors that are closest to achieving that, or countries that are closest to achieving that goal?
So when it comes to, it's a bit hard to generalize, but I think when it comes to sectors, in our analysis, certainly the power generation sector globally would be, I mean, if you're talking about a concerted effort to reduce emissions in the long run, then the global power generation sector certainly has, when it comes to technologies, the best card in its hands. It has a whole host of clean energy technologies that are ready to be scaled up, that are being scaled up big time already today. So there is a great hope that comes with power generation. However, when you look into some other sectors, think about long distance transport, shipping, aviation, trucking, when it comes to heavy industries, iron and steel, cement production, chemicals, there the progress on clean energy technology deployment is much slower. And so the expectation certainly is that for them to reach zero emissions, this will take a little while longer.
One of the things that came with the COVID pandemic and the economic collapse of 2020 was an energy investment crisis, basically massive cutbacks in budgets for every type of energy, from oil and gas right through to renewables. How is that impacting it? What's the concerns of that energy investment crisis?
So energy investment has certainly taken a big hit this year. Our expectation for this year is not very rosy as a result of the outbreak of the pandemic. But
what is not rosy? Is that trillions? Is it 2 trillion? Is it?
No, it's not in the trillion range. But the point is, where are we going to invest in as we are moving out of the pandemic? And what are the investments that we are taking? The investments that we have seen over the last few years were not particularly aligned with a global transition to net zero emissions. The investment that we have seen are going in the direction of where the demand is coming from. And there is demand for oil, there's demand for gas, so there's demand for electricity. So these demands are being catered, but the amount of investments that are going into clean energy technology deployment could certainly be much larger. And here's a matter of decision taking and in fact policy guidance that will hopefully steer us out of the pandemic in a way that we are taking this as an opportunity to change course in the energy sector.
I mean, there's certainly a large amount of stimulus spending, monetary, fiscal stimulus. How does that help? Does it help, do you think?
Depends on how it is directed, of course. What we are seeing is that many governments are putting in place stimulus measures that are meant to support clean energy transitions. It's a means to make your industry ready for the next wave of technology deployment. We are seeing many governments putting in effort or putting stimulus money into battery manufacturing, into electrolyzer manufacturing, so all type of technologies that would be important for clean energy transitions moving forward. So there is a lot of good activity going on in that direction.
It's certainly a critical moment when you're spending trillions of dollars. You mentioned earlier the existing infrastructure, emissions from existing infrastructure. If this money goes into building more carbon intensive infrastructure that we're going to live with for 50 years, that could be a problem.
Yes, but I think it's not only, I mean, when it comes to these investments that are being taken, obviously we need to make the right decisions in terms of the investments that will be taken, preferring clean energy technologies here. But there's also a matter of how do we deal with these kind of assets, and that are already in place, not only about those that we are adding. It helps us to build more and more solar PV panels, more and more wind farms, etc. But we need to get emissions from existing assets reduced as well, so that they don't continue operating coal-fired power plants in particular over decades to come.
Do you think that is possible without a price on carbon? The absence of a price on carbon makes these legacy infrastructure still viable?
Of course, the price on carbon is an excellent way to balance the costs in the energy sector, and certainly when it comes to power generation, but also industry sectors. But I think in practical terms, we have also seen that renewables are now outcompeting coal-fired power generation, certainly new ones, increasingly in many different countries. So the market is already doing quite a lot here. We don't necessarily just have to wait for a global carbon price to come in order to make a clean energy transition happen.
But ultimately, is it a big facilitator, do you think? If we don't get a carbon price, then net zero targets, like you've just outlined, are nearly impossible to reach, would be a general view.
I would not link the achievement of net zero emissions just to a global carbon price. I think this would be just hanging the hopes of the world to deal with climate change on one single policy measure. We have a whole host of other means to address that. We can support RD&D activities. We can support the deployment of individual technology families. We can put in place standards, codes, etc., in order to bring down emissions from the energy sector. There is not just one policy means in order to bring down emissions. There are many of them, and there's nothing against the global carbon price or regional carbon prices. It's an economically excellent tool, of course, but it's not one that we necessarily need to wait for. We have other means in the meantime.
Should oil producing countries be concerned about your report, be concerned about the initiatives that you're articulating?
I'm not sure it's about concern, but there is an increasing number of governments, industries that are looking to address climate change, that are looking to make investments. We are also seeing that in the oil and gas industry that are looking into these type of new business models. So no company will be unaffected by clean energy transitions, and it's obviously a right choice to be made to monitor this carefully. And what we're laying out here essentially in our report is a lot of opportunities. It's technology opportunities, and it's opportunities for new businesses moving forward.
That's quite diplomatic. Nonetheless, it's and you're right. I mean, I live in the UAE. They're investing billions into new energy and diversification. Ultimately, if we look at the technologies that you refer to, and your report obviously is talking a lot about energy technologies, what about the digitization? How important is that a tool within this toolbox?
Digitalization is an important enabler, of course. Digitalization, I mean, has helped in the oil and gas industry with extracting oil and gas. It is an important enabler when it comes to smarter grids, for example, the way we have our homes, our factories interact with the supply of power generation. It is an important enabler, and the better we leverage this type of opportunity, the more efficient are our energy uses, the more efficient we can take advantage of all these various different clean energy technologies that we are deploying in different parts of the energy sector in different parts of the world. So absolutely, it's vital, but it's not one technology family. It's spreading across the entire energy sector in many ways.
In terms of net zero, do you actually have a definition for net zero?
Definition of net zero emissions. So what we are looking in here is net zero emissions for the energy sector. But what people are looking into, of course, when you want to address climate change, then it's a balance in between all the anthropogenic greenhouse gases in terms of sources and in terms of sinks. Right? So this includes obviously also emissions from land uses, etc., etc.
There has been some discussion within the energy industry as to, from the point of view of oil producers, as to whether their net zero calculation should end at when they offload their oil to their customers and not right through to the pipe of burning it in the car. What is the where does the IEA come down on that definition?
So what we are looking for at is not a company level type of consideration. We are looking at the energy sector as a whole, right? And in fact, country by country and for the world as at large. So bringing down the emissions has to happen essentially along the entire supply chain, from production to the end of the pipe, of course. But this is a matter, I mean, this is a company versus a government or domestic type of matter. That is somewhat a different kind of question, I think.
Yeah, we are. Go ahead.
A bit against the clock, if that.
Yeah, I was just going to say the clock. The name of our program is the 2-minute warning, right, which indicates that we're kind of running out of time. Okay. What is your own analysis in terms of how urgent is the deployment of the solutions you've recommended in your report today?
I think there is not much time to lose. In fact, we have seen until last year, we have seen emissions continue to be rising, whereas what we should be seeing is a peak in emissions and have them at a decline as fast and as steeply as possible in order to reach net zero emissions sometime over the next couple of decades. So I don't see why we should be wasting any time here. The fact is that many of the technologies that we're currently looking into, I mentioned electrolyzers before, I mentioned batteries before, they have come down the cost curve. They are increasingly competitive. So there is no reason for us not to start deploying them at significant scale in order to take advantage of them in the energy sector as a whole.
You certainly get the impression from the outside looking into the IEA that it does appear that it has elevated up your priority messaging list. The energy transition does appear to be sort of item number one on the IEA's current messaging list.
So we're looking at the energies, all various different energy sector considerations, from energy security to the affordability of energy supplies and to environmental concerns. And arguably, a clean energy transition is a very, very important part of our work. We have been saying this for many years, that addressing climate change is a must-do for governments. This is what the science tells us. And we are just seeing, in particular now in the context of this pandemic, in the context of governments making moves to roll up their sleeves, put together stimulus packages, we are just seeing a unique, once-in-a-generation opportunity to accelerate the clean energy transition. And this is why, of course, we are trying with the best of our abilities to support governments in this endeavor.
Well, that seems to be a good place to end. Timur Gul, thank you for joining us on 2 Minute Warning, the Middle East Energy Transition Dialogue. There's no harm in all of us shouting a little louder and all of us listening a little bit better to these messages. Thank you for your efforts.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thanks.